What a Nice Guy by Quinn Buckland. What a Nice Guy by Quinn Buckland. A pulsing agony pounded through Alice's head as she slowly regained consciousness. As her senses returned, she felt thick fabric covering her eyes and she was sitting upright, tied to a chair. Her chest tightened and she struggled against the ropes that bound her arms, legs, and body. Her breathing quickened and panic took over. She couldn't think, she couldn't see, and with a fabric gag in her mouth, she could barely breathe. Tears began to stream down her face as she began to hyperventilate, making her head swim. Hanging her head, Alice closed her eyes and screamed through the gag, letting it all out. Then she screamed again and again and again. Each time she felt the panic subside until she could think straight. Alice inhaled through her nose and did what she could to temper her fear. She couldn't tell where she was and was almost certain she was in serious danger, but she wouldn't be able to get herself out if she succumbed to panic. She wanted to keep screaming, she wanted to struggle and fight, but knew none of it would be any use. She had to keep calm and figure a way out. She let out a deep breath and felt at her wrist bindings. There were 3 zip ties fashioned into makeshift handcuffs. She pulled at the ties, testing how much slack was given. There wasn't much, a few inches at most, but it could be enough to build enough momentum to tear the middle tie apart. It was worth a shot. Alice brought her wrists together and forcibly pulled them apart. The plastic dug into her wrists, and she gasped, feeling the sharp plastic cut into her. Gritting her teeth, Alice pulled at her constraints again and again, each time feeling the thick plastic getting longer. At least she hoped that's what she felt. A door opened, and Alice let her hands go limp. The last thing she wanted was for whoever kidnapped her to reinforce her bindings. Before she could think about what she wanted to do next, she perked her head up and acted as scared as she had initially been when she'd woke up. Hopefully, faking her fear would convince whoever it was to keep her alive just that little while longer. "Wow, you're awake already," a man's voice said. "I thought I'd given you enough of a big dose to keep you under for at least another hour. I'll have to do better next time." There was a quick pause, and she heard him move behind her. It looks like those ties won't be enough to keep you still." She heard him approach, and she made a show of ineffectively struggling against her bonds. She had to keep him thinking that she couldn't possibly escape. She made vowel sounds through her gag, hoping it sounded like pleading. Maybe he wanted her to beg. She didn't know, but she had to try. She heard a slight rustling, and something soft and firm slid around her wrist. Her eyes widened as she felt the soft fabric, a rope, cinch around her wrist. And then the other. She heard the rope being pulled through the vertical slats in the wood chair and felt them tighten. As the unseen person approached, Alice was immediately hit with an overwhelming stench of body odor, spray-on deodorant, and other smells she couldn't identify. They were smells she wasn't sure she wanted to identify. She felt warm, clammy hands touch her neck, sending a shiver down her spine and goosebumps along her flesh. The hand moved to the back of her head. She felt some of the hairs pull, and the gag came from her mouth. This was her chance. "Please," Alice begged. "I don't know what you want. I don't have anything. Just please don't hurt me." "Hurt you?" the man's voice asked. "What gave you that idea?" She felt more hairs get pulled, the blindfold was removed, and was surprised at the darkness around her. She watched as a large man walked past her and sat on the other side of a dingy wooden table that was in front of her. What's this?" she asked. "Who are you?" "You know me," the man's voice said, a little hurt. The light came on, blinding Alice for a brief moment. As her eyes adjusted, she got a good look at the room around her. It was missing a bed, so she wasn't in a bedroom, though it was certainly decorated like one belonging to a 13-year-old girl. Anime posters featuring scantily clad girls and women were hung in odd angles, some of the characters she recognized as being underage. The walls were painted a disgusting shade of pink with white trim, and a shelf on the other end of the room held an array of colorful pony figures and PVC figures of anime and video game characters. The man came into her line of sight, and Alice had to think for a moment of the last time she'd seen him. "Carl?" Alice asked. "Carl Jones? Is that you?" Carl stepped back a little, and Alice got a good look at him. He was fat, really fat. His stomach hung over the seam of his overstretched black sweatpants. He wore a yellow button-up shirt adorned with green and red dragons over a black t-shirt deckled with wolves. A large wattle of a chin hung low and was covered in coarse, sparsely grown black hair that lay in patches across his chin and cheeks. Red acne covered his pockmarked face that was topped off with medium-length hair that looked wet, although Alice was sure it wasn't anything more than grease. By the smell of him, Alice guessed Carl hadn't seen inside of a shower in weeks. "I'm surprised you remember me," he said, a smile forming over his wide face. "How could I forget?" Alice asked. "You sat behind me in English class and helped me a lot." She remembered him for much more than helping her. He'd been a major perv, known for ogling breasts, walking behind girls to look at their asses, and staring at people from a distance. He was a loner and a social outcast, and something about that seemed to have suited him just fine. Carl had helped her a lot with understanding Shakespeare and catching some of the deeper themes in Steinbeck's novels, but the real reason she remembered him was his view of personal hygiene. It was sad to think, but Alice believed he smelled just as bad then as he did standing before her. Carl smiled. He seemed to remember helping her as well. That was good. If Alice could build rapport with him, maybe Carl would be more likely to let her go. She'd say almost anything to get him to untie her, even going so far as to agree to be his girlfriend if he asked. Then, once free, she'd break it off, and not kindly. "I'm so happy you remember me," he said, his cheeks flushed as his eyes peered toward her breasts. Alice felt her skin crawl as she felt his eyes undress her in his mind. Memories came crawling back, burrowing into her mind like worms. Carl had been more prevalent in her past than she remembered. He'd always been known as the guy who stared at women's chests and asses without the least bit of personal shame, and was virtually unable to speak with anybody with 2X chromosomes, including teachers. With all that, he was known to walk around with sperm stains on his t-shirts and always smelled like he either just shit or pissed himself. "Why am I here, Carl?" Alice asked, not wasting any time. To her surprise, Carl's eyes drifted away from her breasts and gazed to the floor. Alice could feel some relief breaking through the fear. He knew what he was doing was wrong. All she had to do was appeal to his greater humanity. "Carl?" she asked, her voice softer. "Why am I here?" "I'm sorry," he said, "but it's the only way you'd have to ever talk to me. You didn't even accept my friend request online." Alice swore to herself and instantly regretted that decision. She could have easily accepted the request and just ignored the hundreds of messages she knew she'd get, all of them claiming how he'd worshipped her like a queen, then insult her and call her all sorts of sexist names when she refused to respond. Maybe she could have given him a chance to prove her wrong, but she'd dealt with his kind before, and he wouldn't be anywhere close to the last she'd deal with, provided she managed to get out of his basement alive. Besides, it had been 10 years since she'd last seen him. There hadn't been any reason to accept his friend request. Alice shook her head and fought back the rage she felt shattering her fear and suffocating hope. "Carl, I'm not here because I didn't add you. I want you to tell me in no uncertain terms, why did you kidnap me?"
"I didn't kidnap you,"
he bellowed, sweat beading on his hefty forehead. Alice's brows furrowed as she looked down from the ropes holding her in place. "Carl, why did you kidnap me?" His eyes started to mist over, and Alice could see the crocodile tears coming. He'd do what he could to make her feel sorry for him and delegitimize her anger. Again, it wasn't the first time she'd had to deal with tactics like that. Alice wouldn't be surprised if he chose to make a suicide threat just to try and get her to change his mind. He mumbled something she didn't quite catch. "Speak up, Carl," she said, her voice stern, reminding Alice of her mother's voice when she'd get super pissed about something Alice had done.
"It's because I'm in love with you, and I want to show you how good I can be to you."
The urge to laugh in his face came and was gone almost as fast.
"Carl, Just give me a chance to show you,"
he said, his voice hitting a desperate whine that reminded her of a puppy. And while it would have been adorable as an animal, or a child, it was pathetic to hear from a grown man. "No." Carl's head drooped and tears started to fall from his eyes.
"I just want to show you how good I can be for you."
"You have me tied to a chair, Carl. It's not going to happen." She recalled her earlier thought about agreeing to anything to get out, and found she couldn't bring herself to sink so low. If Carl was going to keep her tied up, he wasn't going to get to enjoy a moment of it. Carl shook his head.
"I know it's going to be an uphill fight, but I'll show you. I promise I'll show you I'll be a good man for you. I'll worship you and treat you like a queen. No, I'll treat you like a goddess. You'll see."
Alice didn't get a chance to get another word out before he rushed out of the room and up the stairs. The door was still open. If anybody was there, they'd hear her call out for sure. Though she doubted anybody else lived with Carl. There wouldn't be any chance he'd be so stupid as to kidnap somebody if just anybody could show up and catch him in the act. She tested the ropes, working the knots to try and get herself loose. If she could slip one hand free from the rope, she could get herself untied and escape. All she needed was one free hand. Wherever Carl had gone, he was preoccupied and would give her time to think and struggle. She heard the sound of clanging pans and kitchenware being moved around. Carl was cooking, though what he was cooking escaped her. She tried to stop the thoughts, but she pictured him pulling out a human body part from the fridge. She could see it vividly, Carl serving her a bowl of tongue stew with a bit of deep-fried liver on the side. Cue the Hannibal Lecter slurp. Where did he get the parts? From the last woman he had captured and confessed his love to. Had she laughed in his face or called him out for his kidnapping? No, she whispered. Stop it. Stop thinking like that. You have time. Just get yourself free and get the fuck out of here. Alice went back to work, wriggling her hands free from the ropes. Despite Carl's shortcomings, he was very good at tying knots. The ropes were loose enough they weren't cutting off circulation to her hands, but they were wrapped in a way that made getting free exceptionally difficult. The ropes were wrapped around her wrists, partway up her forearm, and interlocking between her fingers, restricting how much she could move. But she could feel the ropes coming loose the more she moved around. It would take some time, but she knew she could wriggle her way free. As she worked, the smell of burnt grease wafted down the kitchen, and Alice felt her stomach heave. Whatever he was cooking, it was with oil that needed to have been thrown out long ago. Floorboards above her creaked as footsteps crossed what Alice was sure to be the kitchen area. The creaking moved toward the stairs, and soon she heard Carl's bulk moving downward. She pulled at the ropes with everything she had to no avail, and stopped as soon as he hit the bottom stairs. In Carl's hands were 2 plates of fried chicken fingers and fries. The batter was fried to a burnt deep brown, and the fries didn't look any better. They'd be crispy, which was how Alice liked her fries, but the overused oil would give them a greasy flavor that would upset her stomach. She watched as Carl placed the plate on the table near her while he moved over to the chair on the other side of the table and placed his own plate down. Carl's plate was heaping with chicken and fries, while her own portion was considerably smaller. That was fine by her. She didn't think the greasy meal would sit well, and the less of it she had, the better. "Carl," she said using the mom voice, "how am I supposed to eat? I can't use my hands." Her stomach dropped as soon as she realized what she just said and what it meant. There wasn't any taking it back, as she could see her words hit home in the way Carl shifted in his seat. Popping a sauce-coated nugget into his mouth, Carl smiled as he chewed. He audibly swallowed, and Alice felt bile rise in her throat, already dreading what he was going to say.
"I'll feed it to you," he said. "It doesn't get more romantic than that."
Alice's eyes widened as her chest grew tight. She could already smell his unwashed hands close to her face as he put the disgusting chicken in her mouth. Carl ate another chicken finger, licked his fingers, stood, and made his way to her.
"I should feed this to you before it gets cold," he said. "Do you want sauce on your chicken? I have sweet and sour and honey mustard."
Alice shook her head. No sauce." Carl reached to her plate, grabbed a piece of chicken, and held it to her mouth. The smell of shit and who even knew what else accosted her nose and nearly brought the bile up. She opened her mouth, her breath catching. If she didn't think about it, she could get through it. Alice was sure of it. Carl placed the chicken nugget in her mouth, and she bit down on the crunchy flesh. Tears fell from her eyes as she tried to hold her breath, anything to avoid the overwhelming stench from his fingers, anything to keep from being reminded that he likely hadn't washed his hands from the last time he'd gone to the bathroom. Her tongue met one of his fingers, and something in her resolve snapped. Alice spit the chicken out. "Nope," she said, fighting a dry heave. "Nope, I can't do it." Carl stepped back, his face darkening as he looked down on her.
"I made that for you, and you spit it out. How fucking dare you!"
"Carl."
"No! I put my blood, sweat, and tears into that meal, and you just spit it out? I don't want to hear your excuses. All you females are alike. You can't handle it when a nice guy does something for you. You have to shit all over and spit it directly in our faces."
"I spit it out because you stink," Alice shrieked. "I just watched you lick your fingers and then handle my food. Not to mention, you reek. When was the last time you washed your hands? Hell, for that matter, when was the last time you took a shower?"
"I don't like showers," he shot back.
"You don't like showers?"
"They're time-consuming and unnecessary."
Alice hadn't meant to blow up at him like that. She knew full well that her freedom was dependent on convincing him to let her go. But there was a line he crossed by snapping at her, and Alice wasn't about to let that be. "You know what, Carl? I do remember you from school, but not for being smart or for helping me out. No, I remember you because you were a colossal perv and you stunk just as much then as you do now. Actually, you probably smell better then than you do now. At least your mother washed your clothes for you, so you had something clean to wear every day. Now, I can tell what you're wearing hasn't seen the inside of a washing machine in months, if ever. Do you know why women don't like you, Carl? And that's women, not females, women. It's because you don't take care of yourself." Carl's face contorted into a visage of hurt fury. His massive bulk stepped back, and she could see his hands clench into fists.
"I should have known you'd be more interested in a muscle-headed Chad than somebody with a few extra pounds,"
Carl muttered, crocodile tears welling in his eyes. "Fuck off, Carl. You've never seen my boyfriend." Alice said, her tone getting sharper. "He is a few extra pounds. Believe it or not, Dad bod is sexy to a lot of women. Carl, including me. What's not sexy is full-on not taking care of yourself. You're not just a few extra pounds. You're straight up obese. Morbidly obese."
So looks are important.
Of course looks are important. Why wouldn't they be? Alice desperately wanted to put a cork on her tirade, but couldn't find the strength. She'd been dealing with men like Carl for a lot of years, and the situation before her was too much to keep any sort of lid shut. "But let's start with your diet. You just piled a plate of dirty, greasy chicken and fries that were cooked with burnt oil on your plate, and yes, I know it's burnt oil. I could smell it all the way down here. Go on a diet, get some exercise, shave the patchy scruff from your face, and go take a fucking shower."
Don't you have anything nice to say about me?
Alice stopped as her jaw went slack. She couldn't believe what she'd heard. "You kidnapped me and have me tied to a chair in your basement. In what reality do you think that I'll have anything nice to say about you?"
What about my interests? Lots of people like anime, and the fan base for a lot of these kids shows are adults. I have good interests.
Alice nodded in agreement. "Yeah, lots of people like watching anime. Shit, I like watching anime with my boyfriend. But you know what the difference is between you and Brian?
What?
He doesn't make it weird. Most people who like anime or cartoons that have huge fan bases don't make it weird. The figures you have on your shelf over there, how many times have you jerked off to them?" The fury in Carl's body faded and he shrank. His shoulders slumped and his chin rested on his chest.
That's none of your business.
"More than once?" Carl didn't reply, but the glare he gave her was all the confirmation she needed. "A lot of those characters are underaging. You know that, right?"
No, they're not, Carl shouted. They're centuries old. They were just changed young.
"Because that makes it better." Carl's eyes drifted from Alice and he slowly looked toward his shelf.
"It does,"
he said through gritted teeth. Alice and Carl stared at each other for a long frozen moment, neither one willing to give an inch. Had Alice looked down, she imagined she would have seen him clenching and relaxing his fist in a slow rhythm. But Alice wasn't about to break eye contact for any reason. "Are you just mad because I called you out on your—" Carl had moved faster than Alice expected. The force from the back of his hand on her face sent her chair off balance and she clattered to her side, sending a shock of pain through her shoulder and the side of her head as it hit the concrete floor. She'd bruised for sure where Carl had hit her, and Alice was almost certain the side of her head where she hit the concrete was bleeding. She looked up at Carl, who had tears streaming down his beet-red cheeks.
"I can't believe you made me hit you,"
he said before he started to shake, making his patchy jowls quiver.
"Why did you make me hit you?"
Alice didn't cry. There wasn't any way in hell she'd give him the satisfaction of seeing tears in her eyes or hearing her apologize. "I didn't do any damn thing," she snapped. "You made a choice, and now you have to live with it. You struck a woman. Actually, not just that. You struck a woman who was incapable of fighting back. Does that make you feel like a big man? Do you feel powerful?" Carl looked like he was about to argue back, like he had something to say and she was going to hear every syllable in an ear-bursting shout. But that's not what happened. Carl instead broke down, falling to his knees and covering his face with his hands as he erupted into huge chest sobs.
"I'm sorry," he said. I'm sorry. I'm sorry."
It was pathetic, to say the least. It was obvious he didn't feel bad about what he'd done, just that he was called out as a woman beater. Alice lay on her side, tied to the chair and unable to move. "Fuck you," she grunted. "I'm not going to feel sorry for you, Carl. You haven't done a damn thing to make me feel bad for you." The sobs started to subside, and Alice had started to wonder if he really had been crying. It was possible he'd felt bad for what he'd done, but there wasn't much chance in it. Alice couldn't gamble on Carl having anything close to a conscience if she wanted to escape. Carl pulled his hands away from his tear-soaked face, his eyes cast toward the floor. "You're right," he said. "I haven't been a very good host, have I?" Carl stood and approached her fallen chair. Once again, Alice was accosted with the worst case of body odor and feces she'd ever smelt as Carl lifted her chair with a grunt and put Alice back upright. "I'm going to get you something to drink. Then I think it'll be time for bed." Alice's heart dropped. Bed? No, she couldn't let him take her to bed. She could already feel his fat, greasy hands all over her chest, and she wanted to vomit right then and there at the mere thought. Thankfully, she managed to keep it down and watched in silence as Carl vanished behind the door to the upstairs. Desperately, Alice worked at the ropes around her wrists. Carl may have been a horrible cook, a terrible person, and an affront to the olfactory senses, but he was really good with knots. But with enough wriggling, Alice would be bound to escape her confines. All she'd have to do after she escaped from the chair would be to get outside and find a phone for help. Already, Alice could feel the ropes starting to loosen, even if it was only by a little bit. It would take hours, but alone in the dark she'd have nothing but time. Freedom was in sight. All she had to be was patient. The floorboards above Alice creaked as she heard Carl's bulk move toward the stairs. She stopped wriggling and listened as he came down the stairs. He'd insist on holding her glass for her, and once again bringing his hands close to her mouth. She'd take the water, or at least a sip, just enough to wet her whistle. It should keep Carl happy enough not to investigate her wrists, and maybe make him think that she'd start to come to terms with her not being able to escape. He seemed delusional enough to believe she'd succumb to Stockholm Syndrome in a short amount of time. The door to the basement opened, and Carl came in holding a fizzing glass of cola. It wasn't water, but at least the pop didn't look flat. Alice thanked God for the small miracles and held her breath as best she could as Carl brought the carbonated drink to her lips. Try as she might, Alice couldn't escape the stink of Carl's hand, but the taste of cola did take some of the disgust away, though the stink did seem to change the pop enough for her to not enjoy it as much as she would have otherwise. Carl put the glass of pop on the table and stretched in what Alice thought Carl believed to be in a sexy way. All his stretching did was waft his BO around the room and making Alice want to retch again.
Looks like it's time for bed,
he said, his voice soft in a clear attempt at seduction. He undid the drawstring to his sweatpants, and Alice watched in horror as his pants fell to the floor. Carl hadn't been wearing underwear, and his flaccid, uncircumcised penis drooped like a sad worm desperately trying to hide in an unkempt forest of dark brown hair. Alice had seen worse dicks in her time, but not many. "You put that thing anywhere near me, and you'll be wishing you'd never heard my name," she said, hoping to scare him off.
Alice, Carl said, I'm going to make a deal with you.
Alice opened her mouth to object, but Carl raised his hand, threatening to strike her again, and she immediately closed her mouth.
Like I was saying, Carl said, I want to make a deal with you. I'll let you go in the morning. You have my word on it. But you have to fuck me tonight. All night. You have to do everything I ask, including a blowjob, butt stuff, and maybe even shower sex if we have time. After that, you'll be free to go. I'll never contact you again, and if you choose to call the police, I'll admit to everything. Do we have a deal?
She wanted to laugh. Of all the deals Alice had heard before, she couldn't believe Carl would think for even a second that anyone would see his proposition as a good deal. Sure, she'd be set free and she'd be able to go home and call the police. Carl would be taken away and locked up for a long time. At least that's what he claimed. Alice didn't trust his word any farther than she could throw him. Even if he was telling the truth, she'd have to live with the memory of everything she let him do to her. "No, Carl," Alice said, physically recoiling at the thought of him touching her. "I'm not making that deal. Pull your pants up. I don't want that sad little thing anywhere near me." Carl didn't say anything. He pulled his feet from the elastic ankle cuffs out of his sweatpants and stepped toward her, naked from the waist down.
I'll make you a better deal, Carl said. I'll fill you up. You suck my dick, and you remain here as my sex doll. Don't think I can't find a way to fuck you while you're tied up. Where there's a will, there's a way.
To prove his point, Carl's hands reached toward her and both hands cupped her breasts. Carl's eyes were wild with lust, his hands groping and pulling at her chest. It hurt as he pulled at her, but she wouldn't give him any satisfaction he didn't outright take. In her head, Alice pictured pulling his little pecker off his body and watching him scream as he bled to death. Alice wasn't a violent person by any definition, but anything was preferable to the feeling of Carl's hands slide up her shirt and under her bra to access her nipples. Even fantasies about homicide were better than that. Opening her eyes, Alice could see his penis was fully erect, and she almost laughed once again. She was never one to penis shame. After all, they came in all shapes and sizes, and if the guy knew what he was doing, he could compensate for the size. Carl, though, Alice would think anything she had to do to take away the power he held over her. Flaccid, his dick didn't look any different than any other, but erect, it was clear his member wasn't anything to write home about. It couldn't have been much longer than 4 inches, and the girth was less than impressive. Alice let her laughter go, and the deflated look on Carl's face was almost priceless. "Carl," she said, "you bring that thing anywhere near my face, you'll be looking for it from across the room. That is, if I don't just bite the bullet and swallow it whole and make sure you lose it forever." Carl stepped back. His penis lost its stiffness and became as sad and deflated as his face. His mouth was agape, giving Alice a good look at the black cavities in his teeth. The fat man stared at her for a few seconds before turning around. She had to look away to avoid watching his ass jiggle. Mostly, she didn't want any confirmation of the lack of wiping she assumed his ass had received. When he returned, he was holding a pair of scissors.
"I've gone too far,"
he said, his eyes looking through her.
"In for a penny, in for a pound now."
Alice's chest tightened as he held the twin blades. She waited for the cold steel to push through her skin and slide past the ribs and into her heart. Carl was right. He'd gone too far, and there wasn't any possible way he'd get away with his crime without the cops being called on him. Alice closed her eyes and was surprised to hear the sound of shredding fabric. Carl pulled at the front of her shirt and slid the scissors upward, splitting the fabric and revealing her dark blue bra. She knew what was about to happen, and while she didn't want to struggle and have him accidentally slip and stab her with the scissors, she also didn't want him to cut her clothes away. "Carl, don't," she said, her eyes pleading. "You haven't gone too far yet. You cut my bra away, and there'll be no coming back from that." Something about what she'd said seemed to have reached him. Carl leaned in to cut the front of her bra, but stopped before he could reach the center part. He stopped and met her eyes.
"All right,"
he said, his voice hollow and his gaze distant.
"We'll have sex tomorrow. I think I'm a bit too tired."
Alice fought to keep a straight face while her heart leaped. She'd soon be able to escape. All she had to do was wait for him to go upstairs. Or, if he chose to sleep in the basement, all Alice would have to do is keep quiet as she slowly unraveled the knots around her wrist. Carl passed her and opened a drawer she couldn't see. "Where are you going?" she asked.
"I don't trust you'll stay in your chair all night,"
Carl said, sounding more like his old self, which was a bad sign. Alice felt something metal wrap around her wrist, and her eyes widened as she heard the telltale click of handcuffs. She felt Carl pull the other cuff around one of the chair back supports and then clasp it around her other wrist. She could have cried. She wanted to cry. Any hope of escape she'd had was long gone. She could have wriggled and worked her way out of ropes with cuffs, though. She wasn't going anywhere. And to add insult to injury, Alice heard the sound of scissors and the rope and zip ties were removed from her wrists. Carl was so confident in his cuffs, he didn't believe she'd need anything else holding her in place. Carl gave her a brief glance before turning and walking back toward the stairs. "Where are you going?" Alice asked.
"I think it's best if you have some time to think," Carl said. "I'll be back down in the morning. Maybe then you'll be more willing to participate in some fun."
Carl turned, and Alice couldn't help but see his ass as he walked away, and to her horror, she had been right about his status of wiping. Brown flecks stuck to the inside of his ass cheeks, and the smell coming from it was horrendous. The lights around Alice went out, and she heard the door close behind Carl. Alice listened as the stairs creaked all the way up, then the floorboards above her, until he was in a whole other part of the house. She could hear him moving around, but soon he was still. Alice pulled at the cuffs, swearing as the steel bit into her wrists. Carl hadn't been forgiving with cuff space, and had clasped them pretty tight. There was only one way out, and it relied on luck and flexibility. Step 1. Get her feet free. Step 2. Break the chair. Step 3. Get the cuffs from behind her back to in front of herself. Step 4. Escape. In her head, it all seemed so easy. In reality, it was going to be one of the most difficult things she ever tried. Getting her feet free from the bonds would be the easy part. Thankfully, Carl had removed her socks, meaning that if she can get the ropes around her ankles free from her pants, the ropes would slacken and she can get herself free. Though she didn't want to think of the implications of Carl removing her socks. It was much too creepy to think about. Breaking the chair would be the hardest part. If she did it right, it should shatter into pieces. While it certainly didn't feel as if it could break at any moment, her weight falling on it should at the very least snap the back off the chair. Getting to work, Alice struggled against the ropes binding her ankles. The ropes were tight, but there had been enough wiggle room to lift her feet up a little. She tried kicking and pulling at the ropes, hoping to stretch it just enough to pull her feet free. Sweat beaded on Alice's forehead and ran down her temples and back as she continued what she started calling the leg day from hell. Up and down, up and down, up and down. Alice's feet slapped the bare concrete and her thighs started to burn. Breathing heavy, Alice relaxed her legs and caught her breath. To her surprise, the ropes were considerably looser. It still would be a struggle to get her feet out, but her pant legs had come free from the slightly stretched rope. It was too early to celebrate. So far, only one aspect had gone right, and even then, just barely. Gritting her teeth, Alice focused on getting her right foot free. Making her foot straight, she shimmied the ropes around her ankle and lifted her foot. Getting the rope around her heel was difficult, but after a few minutes of working, she started to make some headway. Once the last wrap of the rope had encircled her heel, Alice lifted as slowly as she could and let out a squeak of triumph. She wanted to scream, to let the world know that she was on her way out of the horrid trap Carl had put her in, but doing so would wake the large, smelly man and would be overall counterproductive. As her foot left the confines of her rope, she felt the bindings over her other ankle loosen. Of all the things Alice had considered, she hadn't thought Carl would use the same rope to bind both feet. It made sense. Why would he use small pieces of rope when he could use one long piece and tie her with both ends? Alice didn't have to work near as hard to get her other foot free. Once she had her feet free, she braced herself for failure. This was going to be the hard part. Alice worked her body forward, trying to get the back legs of the chair off the ground. Pushing herself forward, Alice didn't get the legs off the ground any more than an inch. "Fuck, fuck, fuck," she whispered. "Come on, please." Again, Alice rocked herself back and forth, trying to pull the chair forward with her body weight. She put her back against the chair, drew in a deep breath, and shot herself forward. And again, the chair only rose an inch before falling back to the floor. Alice stopped, breathing heavy. Her stomach hurt and her shoulders had started to ache. Frustrated, she stomped her feet on the concrete until they started to hurt. She wanted to scream, to let it all out, to damn the consequence. Instead, Alice closed her eyes, breathing through her nose and out through her mouth to calm down. Getting angry was not going to get her anywhere. She had to be smart about escaping. "Okay," she said to herself, keeping her voice down. "This isn't working." Bracing herself, Alice spread her legs and placed the balls of her feet on the concrete. She inhaled and held her breath as she pulled herself forward, this time with her shoulders. She pulled up, and miraculously the chair came with her. Alice stumbled, but managed to catch herself before she could fall forward. If she thought getting on her feet was the hard part, she realized breaking the chair would be much harder. She had to hit it in just the right way to break the back spokes. After that, she could slip the cuff chains out and she'd finally be free, albeit still cuffed. Alice did what she could to scan the dark room. Her eyes had adjusted as best they could to the darkness and couldn't see anything she could break the chair's back on. Standing while hunched over had started to put a strain on Alice's back as she did her best to think about what was around her. As far as she could remember, all that was in the basement was a shelf with a bunch of figurines on it, a table, and another chair. There was an idea forming, but Alice didn't think she could pull it off, at least not without hurting herself in the process. She could use the other chair to break the one holding her hostage, but doing so would require her to risk breaking her own back, or at least bruising her spine. Desperately thinking, Alice looked around and felt with her feet anything she could use to break the chair. Sadly, there was nothing else she could find, at least nothing that didn't pose the risk of crippling her in the process. "Fuck," she muttered. "I don't have any choice." Tears fell down Alice's face as she strained to remain upright. Considering what she was about to do, the chair was her best option, and it was what she had to do. With her feet, Alice worked at pushing the chair toward the wall. The last thing she wanted was for the chair to move when she landed on it, not only leaving her chair intact, but leaving her turtled on the concrete floor. If she wound up on her back, there wouldn't be any escaping. Thankfully, the chair was light and easy to push. When it stopped moving, Alice leaned forward and tested the area for a wall with the top of her head. She met the wall with a soft thump and slid her head along the plaster. When she was sure the chair was against the wall, she positioned it with her feet so the back was against the wall. Alice moved to the front of the chair and swallowed despite her mouth being bone dry, prepping herself for the worst. She took in a few ragged breaths through her nose before jumping and throwing herself backward. The back of the chair met the other seat, and Alice heard a loud snap as she felt the back of the chair give way. This was the same time an agonizing pop came from her wrists, and a sharp pain shot up her back, and a sticky wetness spread from where the jagged slat gouged her. She could still feel her legs, which was a good sign, but some of the wood shards had sliced her lower back all to hell. At the other end of the house, she heard Carl shift more than what he should have if he'd just turned in his sleep. The crashing had awoken her captor. Alice's heart sunk, but she willed it back up. There wasn't any time to freeze in terror. She had to get up by any means necessary, even if it meant fighting a man over 3 times her weight. Carl would be dressing, or at least she hoped he was dressing, before coming down. She didn't think he'd have gotten over having his penis laughed at so soon, and would want to avoid that discomfort so late in the night. Alice got back and pulled her arms downward. It was times like that where she was thankful to have arms that were a little longer than normal, a flat ass, and having spent a few years in school as a gymnast, as well as the yoga she'd taken periodically. She pulled the cuffs over her bottom and around her legs. She had to double over a bit more than what was comfortable, but she got through it. With her hands in front of her, Alice felt for the busted chair back and found a piece of wood that had come out of the slots that was still long enough to use as a weapon. Alice gripped in her hands and listened to the sound of floorboards as the massive weight came her way. "Come on," she whispered to the room. "Come on, you fucker. Let's see how brave you are when your victim is armed." She heard Carl come down the stairs, and she took her position by the door. Controlling her breathing, she lifted the broken piece of chair back over her head. One good knock on the head should be enough to knock Carl out. There wasn't any way the piece of wood would be big enough to kill the guy, though Alice was hard-pressed to find a reason past going to prison why she shouldn't just outright end his pathetic incel life. The door didn't open so much as flew open as Carl burst through the threshold. Alice didn't scream or laugh or make a sound of any kind as she brought the piece of broken chair down. She missed the top of his head, but managed a glancing blow off the side of his face and into his ear, sending the large man to the floor with a cry of pain and surprise. Alice bolted up the stairs, not caring about her bare feet or exposed bra. She needed to get out, now. The stairs led to a living room that was filled with empty to-go containers, pizza boxes, and pop bottles around a computer desk, as well as a few bottles that looked to be filled with a liquid much lighter than what their labels suggested should have been in them. Not dwelling on the disgusting possibilities, Alice located the front door and shot toward it. Already she could hear Carl bounding up the stairs as quick as he could, which was remarkably faster than Alice had expected. As she found the door, her fingers fumbled for the door locks. She unlocked the deadbolt and was trying to find the doorknob to spin the small button lock as Carl emerged from the basement.
You,
he said, his eyes wild and furious.
You bitch! You fucking cunt! You goddamn fucking slutbag! I could have been so good to you. I could have shown you how nice I really am, but you didn't want to see it.
Alice spun the button lock and met Carl's eyes. Carl, she said, amazing herself at how calm her voice was. Go fuck yourself. After all, you're the only one who ever will. Without a second thought, Alice spun the doorknob and ran out into the night. In the distance, she heard Carl shrieking her name. When the judge passed down the sentence, Alice managed to keep her face stoic, despite wanting to celebrate. For the charge of kidnapping, sexual assault, and aggravated assault, Carl had been sentenced to life in the Bowden Penitentiary with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Alice watched as the bailiff took Carl away, flinching as Brian placed his hand on her arm. Carl managed to get a look back at Alice, his eyes pleading and wet with tears. That look took any joy from her. It wasn't that Alice felt sorry for him. Frankly, she would have been all right had Carl gotten the death penalty. Not that death was an option in Canadian courts. She wouldn't have thought twice about it had he been put to death, though. No, what sucked the joy from his sentence had been just how pathetic he looked. You all right? Brian asked. She didn't know how to answer. She just had a huge win, but at a hefty cost. Brian had been amazing after the kidnapping, opting to sleep on an air mattress beside the bed so she didn't have to feel alone while also not feeling triggered by the presence of a man. She'd gone to therapy once a week, and after nearly a year, she'd gotten to a place where she could sleep in the same bed as Brian, but physical intimacy had dried up. Alice wouldn't have blamed Brian if he'd chosen to break up with her. She knew how much he loved being physical. But all he'd say when she asked how he felt about her not feeling comfortable cuddling, or having sex, or even holding hands sometimes, was that he was willing to wait for her to be okay. There wasn't any rush, and that he wasn't going to leave her. I don't know when I'll be okay, she said, but I think seeing him leaving in chains and knowing he won't get the opportunity to do what he did to anybody else ever again is probably a step in the right direction. That's good, he said before placing a kiss on her cheek. This should help you heal. Alice turned and met Brian's kind hazel eyes. She wanted to cry, and a tear fell down her cheek. I love you, she said as she pulled herself upward. Alice's lips met Brian's, and for the first time in almost a year, it not only felt right, but welcome.